name's Graham Oppy. I'm a philosopher at Monash University in Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. And my primary academic specialisation is philosophy of religion.
And what got you interested into philosophy, Dr. Graham?
Okay, that's a hard question to answer. Probably it started after I decided that I wasn't a religious believer anymore. So I'd grown up with the kind of conventional Christianity. And when I was like 12 or 13, I decided that I didn't believe it. And I used to have fun discussions with people who were believers while I was in the kind of early years of school. When I was about 16, I got given a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, which I read several times. And I decided that I wanted to be like Russell. And I guess at that point, I'd become interested in philosophy. So I was about 16 when that happened.
Professor Oppy, I had a question in regards to existential inertia and whether or not you believed in some form of it, whether metaphysically in that sense, and if you think this is a good critique of Phaser's argument from motion.
So I guess existential inertia is just a label for a range of views. If you've seen the book that Joe Schmidt co-authored, they in that book and Linford, they consider half a dozen different ways that you might understand existential inertia. When I was responding to Phaser, I didn't actually use the words existential inertia. I'd never heard the expression before. But I just thought that if you think about something that's existing over time, if it exists at a certain time and nothing intervenes to destroy it, to prevent it from existing, then it just goes on existing. And if that's what you mean by existential inertia, then yeah, I believe it. It's not that I think there's a special force operating or something like that, or that there's some addition to physics here. It's just that things don't go out of existence without a cause or a reason.
And would you say that that's a valid critique to Phaser's argument for motion, or just the argument for motion in general? Or would you say that there might be better critiques? So I wasn't thinking of it as so much a critique of an argument as a reason for rejecting one of the premises in an argument. So if you think about Aquinas' first way, there's lots of things to say about it. If you go back to what Aquinas wrote in the 5 Ways and you look at the first way, one thing is that you can kind of reconstruct a valid argument from those materials, but it's not very interesting. Because it gives you a very weak conclusion, you can't get out of the first way premises that God, as Aquinas conceives it, exists, right? You can't establish any of the attributes, like that it's pure act, for example, or that it's absolutely simple or whatever. None of that follows from the first way premises. And so the identification of the thing that you get at the end with God is going to be problematic. And then there are questions about whether in any sense it's going to be very strong, you can get a conclusion that looks like it's God on any conception from those premises. So there's a bunch of different things to say about the first way, and I don't think that you have to accept the claim that, the kind of rejection of something that Aquinas believed in, namely that for things to go on existing, you needed, first of all, God to preserve them in existence, and second of all, you need God's will to concur with their going on existing. And if you didn't have those things, things would just pop out of existence. You perhaps could reject the first way even if you accepted those claims of Aquinas's, because there's a bunch of other premises in there about infinite regress and so on that you might not accept. Is that enough of an answer? Or? Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Oppy. First of all, thank you for your diligent contributions to philosophy of religion. So I got interested in the idea of ultimate causal explanations after studying Leibniz's cosmological argument. And so I read your work on ultimate naturalistic causal explanations. And I want some help understanding your position that if we are to grant that there is an initial part of causal reality, which is necessary, that there's no reason to prefer the idea that it's supernatural or mental over the theory that it's just natural and doesn't have a mind. To me, I struggle. I think there's those two theories have different ideas of how the initial state is causally efficacious. So in the case where the necessary initial state is supernatural, it seems to be that it's an agential state. It's an agent, which is choosing to bring about contingent reality. And then on the naturalist picture, it seems that you have an initial state, and then there are laws which govern how reality unfolds from that initial state. So at first glance, to me, it seems like the supernaturalist theory is simpler because all you have is the initial state. And then on the naturalist picture, you have the initial state and then laws which govern how history is supposed to unfold, if that makes sense.
Right. So I guess I don't believe in laws that govern, so we can move them out of the picture. So let's go back and redescribe, the two setups. So we're imagining that there's causal reality. So there's a network of causation. And we're imagining that there's an initial node, right? There's an initial cause that everything else emerges from. And now the question is about the nature of the initial cause and whether there's some advantage in supposing that it's one way rather than another. Right. Now, in the theistic picture, the way that I'm going to imagine it, God's going to make a first natural state. Right. That's how from the point of view of natural reality, that's the kind of important thing that God does. I mean, of course, you might have a view, so going back to the previous question, where God is doing causing all the way down the track. But if you think that one natural state is sufficient for another, all of that extra causing, the conserving and concurring and so on, is actually kind of redundant and unnecessary and superfluous complexity. So let's just drop that out. Right. So we have this picture where you have an initial natural state and there's a causal network that unfolds from that. Or you have a picture where you've got an agent that makes the first initial state and everything unfolds from that. That makes it look as though the theist picture is more complicated, right? So now let's ask the question, what's the status of that initial thing? And you might say, well, it would be better, I think, to say that it's necessary rather than contingent. Fine, we can do that either way. Right. Next question, which is the one that you were really asking, what's the nature of the causation? If we think that we've got a personal cause versus we think that we've got a natural cause, is there some difference that makes the personal explanation simpler than the natural explanation? Well, it's hard to see how that could be the case. In either case, we're going to suppose that there's some causal power that's sufficient to generate the subsequent states. And it's not clear why we should think that the power in question is going to be simpler on one view rather than the other. So okay. that would be how I would respond, rather than thinking about there being laws and laws somehow having some kind of efficacy, which just seems really weird. Right. Let's talk about something more like causal powers, and then it looks like you've got causal powers on both sides.
Yeah. Okay. So my concern would be about the activation of that power, like how that unfolds on either view. on the supernatural picture, if you subscribe to something like agent causation, the agent is the cause of the activation of its power. And on the natural picture, I want to see what the analog is there.
So it's a bit hard to see how you could be the cause of the activation. I mean, that just makes it sound like you've got an extra step of causing or something like that before the power gets exercised. It's rather just that the way that we would describe it is the agent just does stuff, right? Sure. But on the other picture, the universe just does stuff. It expands, whatever exactly the story is about the natural evolution of state of the universe. So it's not clear to me that there's a kind of relevant difference here that bears on the simplicity or the kind of explanatory power of either of the pictures.
Okay. I can see, like, conceptually, I can see how an agent just does stuff, but I can't see how a non-agent just does stuff. Like, for me, the capacity to just do stuff is what it means to be an agent.
Okay, so that seems kind of false to me too, for a different reason, because I think that the only agents there are natural organisms, and right. they don't just do stuff, right? And what's true is they do stuff, but there's a mechanism by means of which they do stuff, and the postulation of agents that don't have any mechanisms is kind of mysterious, and it seems like it's an additional theoretical cost because now we've got two kinds of agents, those with the mechanisms and those without. You're postulating extra kinds of things, and that's a theoretical cost too.
I see. So you're saying that the lack of simplicity would consist in the fact that this agent would not have a mechanism in...
Well, you'll be thinking that there are more kinds of agents, right? So if you think about the various dimensions of simplicity, one of them is theoretical. It's just the way that I describe it, how compact the axiomatization of your theory of everything is. Another thing is how many kinds of entities you postulate. The fewer kinds, the better. And so every time that you kind of make a duplication of kinds, that's a theoretical cost. Right now, it's not clear that you're purchasing anything here in terms of the explanation of what happens in the universe by postulating God, versus the picture which just says, well, the initial state's necessary and everything else just follows by natural causation. It doesn't look like there's any extra stuff about natural reality that you're explaining by postulating the extra kind of person without a mechanism. So that's the way that I would see the assessment going. And I'm not really invested in arguing that too much in the claim that the naturalistic picture is obviously better. It's just that it seems pretty clear to me that it's no worse. And so if you accept it, you're kind of on as good territory as anybody can be on.
Okay. So I have one last idea in response to that. I think that in our direct experience as agents, there's nothing about our experience of agency which essentially requires that we must act through mechanisms.
Okay, so
even though it might focus,
yeah. So if you focus on first personal experience, your experience of yourself, that's true. But if you focus on your experience of other agents, dogs and other people and so on, and you try little experiments removing the mechanism, you find that you don't, well, actually, you better not do those experiments on people, right? Or on dogs for that matter. But I mean, counterfactually, we know no brain, no action, right? So we have, as Hume would have put it, the most complete proof from experience that you don't get agency without mechanism. It's just that you don't have direct access to the mechanism in your own case. Right. That's all that's going on there.
Yes, I agree with that argument. But what I'm saying is, from our first person experience, there is something that makes sense to agency without a mechanism. Like it's intuitive. Experimentally.
So that might be right. That might be right, but intuition's highly fallible. And
Sure.
you kind of know that from the clash of intuitions in philosophy. And then intuition's malleable too. It's modified by experience. So I don't find the notion of an agent without a mechanism in the least bit intuitive. Right. Now, that could be just a fact about me and you might be different, but right.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Oppy. I wanted to bring up Brian Cutter and Dustin Clement's argument from Psychophysical Harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they argue that certain correlations between mental phenomena and the environment, as well as to other mental phenomena, are quite surprising on atheism or naturalism, but not so surprising on theism, and so provide decent support for theism. What do you make of this argument?
Okay, so I'm an identity theorist. I think that mental states and processes just are brain states and processes. So there's no mystery about correlation because there's just one thing there, right? If you're an identity theorist, you have a very straightforward response to this argument. And it won't, there's no reason for me to be concerned about people who think that these are distinct. That's their problem. It's not my problem. So one thing to think about is other cases where so imagine ancient Babylonian philosophers haven't realized that the thing that they call phosphorus and the thing that they call Hesperus are one thing, a planet. They think that there are two distinct things there. And imagine that they develop a certain amount of ability to discern properties of these two things without realizing that there's just one thing. And they notice that there's this extraordinary match in the properties. The content of sulfuric acid in the atmosphere is exactly the same for these two things. And the amount, the average luminescence of the two bodies is the same and so on, right? And so they see this bizarre correlation, right? This very strong correlation of the properties, right? They could argue, well, this is extraordinary, right? There's ever so many ways, right, that these two different things could have been. How extraordinary that there's this perfect match of the properties. When somebody comes along and says, but look, there's just one thing here, the planet Venus, the mystery disappears immediately, right? So that's what I want to say. You can think about that sort of imaginary case as a useful way of thinking about why the argument from psychophysical harmony really doesn't have any persuasive force.
Good, thanks. So, I mean, regarding identity physicalism, they maintain that there still are data of harmony, given that there are many epistemically possible relations between the mental phenomena and the environment, which involve disharmony. It's still surprising that the mental phenomena we have happen to be the physical phenomena which correlate in these harmonious ways. So they contended the argument can still succeed given identity physicalism. What do you think?
Right, but then you're thinking about that, ignoring the fact that there's only one thing here, right? From the if the identity theorist is right, there's no such problem, right? And it's not like there's a kind of direct argument from there's all these other ways that things could have been, when actually, if the identity theory is right, there are no other ways that things could have been, right? So there's a kind of a mistake, I think, being made when you come to assess what if you're thinking about the range of theories here, right? You might think that there are dualistic theories and all kinds of alternatives. But when you think about the identity theory, if the identity theory is right, there is no difficulty in explaining the correlation whatsoever, because the correlation is just a consequence of there only being one thing that you're observing. So I don't see why you would think that somehow or other there's a problem here for people who have what I take to be the correct view of things.
Yeah, I guess what they would say in response is that, yeah, even on identity physicalism, there can be harmony because, well, we'll take some particular mental state, like some pain state. The fact that that pain state is this physical state and happens to, correlate in certain harmonious ways with the environment is still surprising, right? It's still, there are many epistemically possible other ways it could have been.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it's this way, even if it's, even if identity physicalism is true, is sort of surprising.
Right. So I don't see how that could be the case. I would have thought that it's kind of intrinsic to pain states that they're unpleasant. There's something that it's like to be in this kind of physical state, and that the way that it's like is that it hurts, right? And you can't prize those apart. It's not like we can imagine an alternative evolutionary history where if something venomous bites you, it just feels great, and you'd go searching it out to bite you again and again and again until you die, right? That, from an evolutionary point of view, that makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, but it was still at least an epistemic possibility that the mental state was something else, right?
Well, but if we're thinking about the sort of functional roles of the states, it's part of, you touch a hot stove top and you immediately withdraw your hand. It's not like there's a kind of separability of or even a conceivability of a world where you touch the hot stove top and it hurts like hell and you leave your hand there, right? How could creatures like that have emerged at all, right? While the hand is kind of being burned to a crisp.
Hi, Dr. I first want to thank you for coming to speak with us today. What I want to ask is I want to ask a couple like one broad question and then some more specifics. So my first broad question I want to ask is what's your view on the philosophy of religious language? And I want to be a little bit more specific. What are your views on the more anti-realist views, such as Wittgensteinian or the positivist ones? Or expressionists too.
Okay, so I'll start with logical positivism. So Ayre's logical positivism turned out to be kind of self-undermining. And in general, I don't think that there's a kind of nice positivistic theory of language. So for a range of reasons. So I'll just kind of shelve that one. I've written a bit about the kind of Wittgensteinian approach to religious language, and I don't think much of it either. What I think happened with Wittgenstein and with people like Norman Malcolm, various people, so the kind of Wittgensteinians who came after Wittgenstein, is that they didn't properly appreciate distinction that was first clearly understood by Grice. So Malcolm, for example, claimed against what is a kind of orthodox view that knowledge entails belief, that there are circumstances in which it would just be wrong to say you believe something, namely those situations in which you know it, right? It would be conversationally inappropriate to say, I believe. And the conclusion that Malcolm wanted to draw is that knowledge doesn't entail belief, but that was just a mistake. Right? As Grice pointed out, there are various conversational constraints on productive conversation. And one of the constraints is that when you're in a position to say something, you should say the most informative thing that you can. If you know something, you shouldn't just say that you believe it, because that leaves open the suggestion that maybe you don't know it. right? And so it's true that knowledge entails belief. You can't know without believing. But sometimes it'll be conversationally inappropriate to say, I believe, because you know. Okay, now that error is one that you find, I think, throughout Wittgenstein's writings. He has all these stuff all these claims that he makes about the grammar of ordinary language, and the grammar of ordinary language, for example, includes this claim that knowledge doesn't entail belief. I think that that's just, for Gricean reasons, that's just getting it wrong. And so that's a kind of big theoretical reason why lots of the stuff that Wittgenstein and subsequent Wittgensteinians have said about religious language just turns out to be incorrect, according to me.
Would that be like
I hope
all?
that's useful.
Yeah, I agree. It's useful, sir. Would it be like all subsequent Wittgensteinians, or like would some of the more contemporary ones, like Pritchard or Diamond, would they also?
It wouldn't be all of them, but you would have to look closely, because obviously after Grice, some of them have read Grice, and so there'll be certain kinds of really gross errors that they won't make that earlier Wittgensteinians did. But there's still, what I gave you was one line of critique. There are other lines of critique that you could make as well. So no, I'm not going to say that, that Cora Diamond, everything she says is vitiated by Grice. I'm certainly not claiming that.
Okay, yeah. So like, I'm going to be a little bit more. So you would also include like DW or Dewey Zephaniah, DZ Phillips, I assume as well, like this list of people.
Yeah, I would definitely include Phillips on the list. Okay. I think that he makes this mistake quite often, I think.
Yeah. So with somebody like more contemporary, like Duncan Pritchard, who probably takes a little bit more of like Wittgenstein's like later letters on like religious language, and he kind of makes it into like a type of epistemic theory about like religious epistemology. Do you think what particular? I assume you think there is an error in that type of view. What type of particular error do you see in that view?
So it might not be that it's wrong. So I haven't read what Duncan Pritchard's written about Wittgenstein on religion, but the story that I want to tell about epistemology will make it permissible for people to believe all kinds of things. So some people think that is rationally permissible. Some people think that if you've got some body of evidence, there's just one thing that's rationally mandated by the evidence. Or some people think that given a body of evidence and given some set of prior beliefs, there's just one belief that's rationally mandated by that setup. And I'm inclined to think that neither of those views is right, though the first one's more clearly wrong than the second. So I'm inclined to think that that it's rationally permissible to hold all kinds of religious beliefs. And if that's the kind of upshot that Pritchard's going for, then we'll end up on the kind of same side.
Well, Pritchard agrees that it's like rationally permissible to believe all types of like religious beliefs. But I guess the reason he believes it is he relies on more of like Wittgenstein's kind of, I don't know, this is more of a newish term, like epistemic angst or positist view. So like the idea is like the reason why it's rational to accept religious beliefs is that, any types of like particular ways of going about doing beliefs are in like a particular field have certain like irrational constraints. So like, religious beliefs are just like, another type of field among all these other fields that have these like types of irrational constraints.
So, and I guess I come at it from a slightly different angle, just thinking about the massive amount of disagreement that there is in philosophy and religion, and I guess also in politics, and about the distribution of cognitive qualities, things like intelligence and sensitivity, thoughtfulness, exposure to evidence, and so on. And trying to put those two things together That is the enormous amount of disagreement, and the way that cognitive virtues seem to be equally distributed over the disagreeing parties. And so it seems to me that that kind of drives us in the direction of thinking, okay, there's got to be a whole lot of permissiveness, right, in what it's reasonable for people to believe. Right. So I guess that's not quite the same direction, but it feels like it gets us to a similar spot.
Yeah. Well, I hold I guess to tell my motivations for asking these questions, I hold a type of, I guess theistic, theological anti-realist kind of view. And and I guess part of my one of the things that I want to go over this idea for you, but one of the things I kind of come to the conclusion of holding these types of views is I think that most arguments for God in theological circles don't actually argue for God's existence, but actually more or less are kind of self-contained in their, specific ways of doing things, or, theological ways of finding knowledge or whatever. They're contained in that, and specifically more or less they're kind of self-confirming prior beliefs they have about the properties that a God might have, right? So for example, the argument from first cause would argue that God is the first cause, or the argument from contingency argues that it's a necessary being, or fine tuning would argue for agency. But it's only the case that these these arguments argue for a God, at least in my view, if you already kind of are committed to this theological way of life or whatever, religious way of life.
So it might be worth thinking about, for example, the way that Swinburne argues for the existence of God, because Swinburne takes it that there's just a whole range of relevant considerations and you have to weigh them all up in deciding. Yeah, and then it will still be the case. He's coming from a particular religious perspective, but the kind of approach that he takes seems like it would be adaptable to almost any theistic religious approach, right? It's presumably you're going to think that when you weigh everything up, after you've weighed everything up, it favours your position, whatever it is, whether you're Muslim or Christian or Hindu, whether you're atheist, agnostic or theist, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not really super knowledgeable on the Swinburne argument, but how I have it explained to me, at least the critiques of the view, is that it's isn't it a type of Bayesian argument? I think it's a type of Bayesian. I'm not familiar, sir. I'm not super familiar with the argument.
Right. So it is a Bayesian argument, but you can make an argument like it without accepting the kind of Bayesian stuff if you don't like the Bayesian stuff. The thing is going to be, okay, you've got your view, there are competing views, there's all this stuff that we might explain or seek to understand through our theories. And I think my theory does the best of making sense of things, right? Or don't call it a theory, call it your worldview or whatever. It makes the most sense of things, right? That's if you really kind of go to a high level of generality, that's what Swinburne's doing. He's not picking some particular bit of data and saying, look, my view, great at explaining this particular bit of data. He's saying, of all the views, mine's the best because it fits everything that we can take as common ground between us best.
It feels like that the reason he thinks that this cumulative case is really compelling is primarily based on his the reason I brought up the Bayesian stuff is primarily based on his priors or his prior commitments. And I know you could probably take that argument and move it over to a Muslim religious context or a Jewish one. But I'm kind of suspicious that you can, and this is just a broader suspicion because of some of the theological commitments or metaphysical commitments that the Muslim or Jew or Hindu might have, right? So for example, whether or not God's identical with his attributes, or what does it actually mean for God to be simple under these particular views. And that's going to affect partially, I think, how you make your cumulative case.
I think that whatever view you take, there'll be a range of data that you'll think you need to explain that will overlap with the data that Swinburne thinks he needs to explain. So there'll be questions about evil that are going to come up. If you're a theist who thinks that there's a very powerful, very wise, very good God, then there's something to be explained there. There's also the question about the existence of the universe. Now, if you're a Hindu, you might not think that that's, that you need Brahman to explain that. But if you're in the Abrahamic traditions, whichever one you go with, you're going to think that you should be explaining that, and so on, right? So it's not clear that the differences between the theistic religions are going to radically change the range of things that you're taking into account when you're trying to make a case that your view is better than competing views.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So somebody asked a question on text. They said, what do you think of views pertaining God's omniscience that express God's omniscience to be non-propositional, like William Anson for one?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch all of that. What do I think about views that claim that God's omniscient but claim that his knowledge is not in propositional form? Was that the question?
Yes. Yeah. That is expressed in a non-propositional form. And for one, somebody the host of this would be William Anson.
So I think you could, sure, that's one of the views, right? One thing to notice is that even if you think that God's knowledge is non-propositional, you presumably think that God's knowledge commits you to affirming that God's knowledge entails that a whole lot of propositions are true. Even if you think that God doesn't know directly that 2 and 2 are 4 because God doesn't have propositional knowledge, presumably God's non-propositional knowledge entails that 2 and 2 are 4. Right? It will be a consequence. So I'm not sure that it's really going to make very much difference if you try to insist that God's knowledge is not propositional. You're still going to end up with this commitment to some claim like this, that God's knowledge entails the truth of all of these propositions. Maybe that's misunderstanding the position, but that's what I would have thought would follow.
So somebody said earlier, you mentioned that 3 out of the 5 ways pertaining Thomas Aquinas's attempt at proving God don't follow. How about the 2 other ways? They're asking, if they don't follow, then they do, then why not affirm a necessary being like Aquinas does?
So it depends what you mean by follow here, right? So if we're analysing an argument, we've got the argument into a form where you've got a bunch of premises and a conclusion. There are 2 questions to ask. One is whether the conclusion is adequately supported by the premises. In the case of Aquinas's 5 ways, it's meant to be that the conclusion's a logical consequence of the premises. They're meant to follow by logic. And then there's this question about whether they do or they don't. And then the other question is about the truth of the premises. In my book, Arguing About Gods, I claimed that, at least in the case of the first 3 ways, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. In fact, I can't remember now whether I discussed the 4th and the 5th ways there. I think I didn't. But I would have been prepared to say the same thing in those cases as well. The conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. You might think, okay, that might be correct, but maybe we can come up with a new argument in which the conclusion does follow from the premises, and we have many of the same premises as before. So there's still a reason to go on and discuss the premises, even if you don't think that the conclusion follows. And in the tradition, there have been lots of attempts to so we talked about Phaser way back near the beginning. Phaser's version of the first way what he calls a version of it. It's a much more complicated argument. But in it, the conclusion follows from the premises. It's just that some of the premises seem to me to be false. Right. So is that enough to answer the question, or do you want to ask me something else?
Yeah, I was saying it's more of a hypothetical, not a question. Suppose that God is omniscient, omnipotent, transcendent in every aspect, basically, and we humans have brains have limited capacity, right? So to what extent should we study God enough to be believing in him? Is it like 100% understanding, or how much?
So if you think, as lots of theists do, that God's sort of totally other, so that you just can't form any comprehension of God, it seems that trying to study God is not going to be a useful activity, right? Because it won't get anywhere. For people who are in that position, there are, though, ways and means that have been proposed over the course of a very long history of theological thought about this. So one thought is that even though you can't form any genuine comprehension of the divine, you can think about the divine by analogy. And that gives you some kind of understanding. So I take it this is the position of somebody like Aquinas. And it's also a position that's adopted by some earlier Muslim thinkers as well. Right. So that would be one way of going. A different way of going is to deny that you can't form any conception of the divine attributes. And you find that lots of Protestant thinkers after the Reformation have supposed that you can form some positive conception of omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, and so on. And that there's a kind of literal meaning that attaches to those terms that's directly understandable. Right, so there's a conflict between different theological traditions on that point.
Hello, Graham. Good evening. I was going to ask, in your opinion, what's the most compelling argument for God? And also, are you agnostic with an I?
Am I agnostic? So can you tell me what that means?
Like, do you hold to a form of theological non-cognitivism? So, like, for example, you believe the statements about God and this whole debate is meaningless until, like, there is, like, the word God is defined. Some people don't believe that, it really has meaning.
Right. Okay, so we talked earlier about logical positivists. So Ayer, for example, claimed that talk about God was meaningless because you couldn't give any meaning to the word God. That position is one that, at least in kind of academic philosophy, very few people have tried to defend since the kind of late 1970s. There are some. So Michael Martin, for example, kind of flirts with that idea. But most people accept that we can give some kind of meaning, though there are different meanings that different people give to the term. And so when you're in a conversation with somebody, you'll have to check how they're understanding the term in order to have the conversation. I think that there's other parts of the philosophy of language that are kind of important here. So consider, for example, the claim that Superman wears a suit. Sorry, the special suit, right? Wears the suit. I think that's false. I think it's false because there's no such thing as Superman. There are other people who think that it's true, but what makes it true is different from what makes it true that you're a person, because it's not that there is actually a Superman who wears a suit. Rather, there's a whole lot of stories, and those stories say that Superman wears a suit, and that's what makes it true that Superman wears a suit. Now, if you try and apply this to claims about God, for example, the claim that God's omnipotent, I'm going to say that's false because I don't think that there's anything that answers to the term God. Other people who are non-believers might say it's true, but what makes it true is just that there's kind of a tradition, or there are stories, and those stories or the tradition says that God's omnipotent. So that makes it the case that God's omnipotent even though God doesn't exist. When you're talking to people, you need to be clear which way they're jumping on this particular distinction as well.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, just to follow up on that, if there was something to be proven, like a being that was omniscient and had like these attributes of a necessary being, would you say that's God, or would you say no, it's not necessary that this is God?
So it seems to me that there's a range of different things that, were they true, was there a being that satisfied this description, it will be a good candidate to be God, assuming that there were no other candidates, right? And if we suppose that there can only be one God, which is pretty common, right? One God with a capital G. So if it turned out that there was something that was omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, sole creator of everything else that can be created, that would be a good candidate to be God. If there was such a thing as pure act, that would probably be a good candidate to be God too, right? And we could go through the various religious traditions, look at the different conceptions of God, and say the same thing about each of them, right? Were there something that answered to that description? Yes, that would be a candidate. That will be God if nothing else answered. Nothing answered to any of the other descriptions.
I see. So do you believe there are other candidates?
Other than saying that God's the omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good sole creator of all else? Well, there are candidates like the Thomistic one, which says that God's pure act. Now, do they think that there's a kind of positive attribute of being omnipotent that God possesses? Did Aquinas think that? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But you can imagine a version of the view that doesn't. Right? So, I mean, one of the issues here, a slightly different issue, is what you say about divine simplicity and your view about what are sometimes called the divine names, right? So you might think that, to take one view here, that omnipotence and omniscience and perfect goodness don't name different things, right? Or you might think that they do, right? You might think that there are distinct attributes here, or you might think, no, there's just God, and all of these are just kind of different ways of pointing to God. There's a whole lot to unpack in that kind of discussion as well.
The question I'm going to be asking you is not really within any specific topic in the philosophy of religion, but about like philosophy of religion in general. So the thing is, generally through my observation of philosophy of religion, especially in the English-speaking world, there has been, I think, a general oversaturation of analytic philosophers who are often inputting, or usually getting themselves involved in the discussion. And, I guess the question I have here is, first of all, do you see any hope for for example, postmodern thinkers or continental philosophers themselves getting involved into philosophy of religion? Because generally what I've seen, like, for example, someone like, a very popular name in the continental is Jean-Luc Marion. Right? I don't know if you've heard of him, but, he seems more or less involved in philosophy of religion, because for him, he's not per se concerned about, debating on the fact of God's existence, but rather, disclosing, or investigating what is God, right? And so I would just like to hear, your understanding of this, or of this whole, like the way, philosophy of religion in its current context is heading towards. right? Or being inclusive of these other discussions of God.
Okay, so I have a colleague at Monash. His name is Chris Watkins. He wrote a book called, I think it's called A Difficult Atheism, and it's from a Continental perspective. There's a range of contemporary Continental thinkers that are the subject of attention in that book. So on the first point that you raised, it's clear that there are Continental philosophers working in philosophy of religion. I could have given other examples. A former colleague of mine, Kevin Hart, who's left Monash 20 odd years ago and moved to the States, is another person in the Continental tradition who's written a lot about religion. I mean, he's most influenced by Derrida, and he writes, but he's written quite a lot of stuff about that connects Derrida and religion. So there's no question about kind of activity in the field. Whether there's going to be a conversation between all of these different people seems kind of less likely to me, just because even within analytic philosophy of religion, there are factions that don't really talk to each other very much, and there's not much interchange between them. So if you think, for example, we talked earlier about the Wittgensteinians. The Wittgensteinians generally are not that much interested in talking to people who spend their time analysing particular carefully formulated arguments for or against the existence of God, right? Their interests are just so far apart. So whether there's going to be, as I think there has been, whether increasingly in the past, and so I assume this trend will continue, but whether there's going to be lots of interaction between people who read Marion and people who read Plantinga, that's not really clear, because it's not clear that there's a kind of enough overlap to get a substantial body of people who want to read the two together. Okay, so that was a fairly Weasley answer, I think, but it's an answer.
Yeah, but, I just kind of see this as a problem when, because what I've generally noticed in academia is that people are becoming, more and more fractured. And as a result, they're kind of in their own little bubbles, with their own, particular language. And I think that harms that, I think that stops what, fundamentally what, philosophy was originally, attempting to do, which was, the completeness and unity of the sciences, for example. That was Leibniz's role. Hegel attempted it. Also Frege and Russell, if you remember, they spoke a lot about, the completeness of knowledge. And so, I guess the worry here is that as these sciences get further and further fractured, it's going to be, as you said, difficult for these conversations to happen. And then, what ends up happening is that all this effort that we're, publishing papers and stuff like that just ends up just staying there, and they don't ever reach, the public, or they become something, you could say practical in that sense.
So one of the things that's happened, and really it started with the big surge in universities from the middle of the 19th century, is that it's impossible for anybody to be across even more than a tiny fraction of the work that's done in any academic discipline, except perhaps if you get in right at the ground floor and you're one of the first people breaking new ground in a new area. And to go back to Russell was reasonably good at talking to other people, but there were people that he thought were just completely beyond the pale at the time. Okay, that was a little aside. Right, the last person in the UK of whom it was said that he knew everything, by which it was meant that he was kind of across all of the developments in all of the disciplines, was Young in about 1800. Right, So it's inevitable, just because there are so many universities and there are so many people working in them, and in every discipline there are so many people, that a whole lot of conversations are just not going to happen, right? So you might be sorry that we don't live in the world that people like Descartes and Leibniz lived in, where there were very few people like them and they could communicate with one another. But as the world is now, that's just something that belongs to the remote past.
I can't understand that sentiment, but I guess the issue here becomes the nature of education, because I guess the way you're looking at it, you're looking at it in terms of like knowledge as information, can we read through all the scope of material, possible? But let's take, for example, Kant, right? Kant, the goal of education is to be independent, to form your own opinion, not in a sense of a Millerian sense, where, the issue is to produce as many opinions as possible, but to take what, people tell you and to appropriate it as your very own. So I guess maybe we can talk about here is issues about the nature of the education system and philosophy, and perhaps these are avenues that perhaps we should focus more on. Because, we often talk about philosophy of religion, philosophy of biology, but we never talk about philosophy itself, I feel.
So one of the questions there is a question that's kind of much talked about in educational circles, including in particular in those circles where philosophers talk about instruction in critical thinking, right? Is there kind of discipline-independent critical thinking? Is there any education that we can give to people that's not actually tied to particular subject matters? Because, as you just pointed out, we can't educate everybody about everything. My own suspicion is that there's nothing very interesting to be said about critical thinking in general, which is the kind of ideal that Kant had. And of course, that's contentious, but there's at least a worry that your thought that, there's somehow or other there's going to be this kind of central curriculum where we can teach people how to think, and they can then just apply it to physics or maths or biology or living well or religion or sociology or whatever. That's just an unrealisable thought.
Hi again, Professor Oppy. So yeah, I had a somewhat long question about fine-tuning, although I'll try to be quick. It's sort of related to the stalking horse objection. So if we consider two hypotheses, the first says that the universe is, how we happen to find it with the physical parameters we've discovered and such, and I won't fill in the details here, and that this universe was not the result of design. The second hypothesis says the same things about the details of the universe, except instead that this universe was the result of design. Now, it seems to me that it's at least reasonable to have similar, albeit very low, priors on both of these hypotheses. And since both hypotheses entail that their life-permitting conditions are similarly confirmed by that datum. But if this is right, then the fact that there are life-permitting conditions cannot significantly favor design to non-design. Ignoring alternative theories, plausibly, our posterior would be about 0.5 on each. Does this seem right to you?
So maybe, but let's start by considering a very different kind of thought experiment. So suppose that you're a Bayesian, you've got no evidence one way or the other about whether God exists, except that you live in a community where there are 20 people and they all say that God exists, right? So what should you do? Well, it feels like you've got some reason to believe in God, right? So just the fact that there's a bunch of people who believe no one doesn't believe gives you some reason to believe, right? Is that kind of interesting? Well, no, because the kind of interesting question isn't whether you can sort of partition your evidence in a way that gives you a case that's favourable to your view. Because we could all do this. I know lots of people who are atheists. If I just consider them, all of them don't believe. So just relative to that evidence, I've got some reason to think there's no God. What you have to do is you have to take all the relevant evidence into account, right, in order to be making a kind of useful contribution here, right? So I think it's just not interesting what the fine-tuning says on its own, particularly, the way that you described it, because there's going to be, questions of detail about why on each account the fine-tuning, why the fine-tuning happens, when and where and how and so on. And that might point to differences, or it might not, but it will surely lead you to be asking a bunch of other questions, so that you'll need kind of a bigger theory and more evidence to be considered.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess the point was just that, like, look, if we have two hypotheses, one's a design hypothesis and one's a non-design hypothesis, both of them have sort of similar priors and both equally predict the data, well, how can it be that the data is significant evidence in favor of the design hypothesis?
Right. Yeah. So, but there might be other theories that do much better than those two. Right. So, and they might lead you in the direction of naturalism, or they might lead you in the direction of theism. It depends, right, on the further details. But I think, the general point or the general lesson that I want to draw from the point that you're making is we should consider more. We should consider bigger theories. We should consider more of the real data, because otherwise we're getting these results that actually aren't that interesting. Assuming that it's a result, does it really matter that, for just this data and given those priors, they come out roughly equal? Well, nobody's in the evidential situation where they've got just that evidence and just those priors, right?
Right, that seems fair, but like, do you not agree that, even setting those concerns aside, that this is a good response to the kind of Bayesian fine-tuning argument? Like, the argument doesn't even succeed on its own terms.
Yeah, but I'm happy to say so much for every evidential argument on its own when you pick a little bit of the evidence, right? There is a kind of general lesson to be learned.
Really quickly before I ask, out of curiosity, Oppy, who's in the photo to your right behind you?
Okay, so let me see if I can turn the camera around a little bit further. Okay, so there are actually two people here. So the one on the right, that one is Camo Jackson. So that's Frank Jackson's father. Camo was one of the two foundation professors at Monash University, which was founded in the very early 60s. And the other one is Hector Munro, who was the other of the foundation professors of philosophy at Monash. Hector's most famous for writing a book of sonnets, very amusing sonnets about well-known philosophers.
Okay. That's very interesting. Okay. Very cool. My question was that I've been looking into differences between, I'm seeing if you might know, I'm looking at differences between views on subjective and objective Bayesianism, specifically how exactly these views weigh their priors. And from my understanding on subjective Bayesian accounts, it's more or less up to, like the credence we're going to give to some set of priors or another is going to be somewhat almost intuitive, or how strongly we feel towards these priors and whatnot. And I never understood how maybe some other view, like objective Bayesianism, I'm not too sure what it does, but in terms of translating that ordinal value, just like how strong we feel about some set of priors over another, and then turning that into some sort of cardinal value, giving it like 0.05. do you, in your view, have any position when registering the strength of certain priors over others? Do you have a view that you like the most or you find the most appealing?
So I guess I have, like many people, I have various misgivings about different kinds of Bayesianism. The way that subjective Bayesianism is supposed to work in the sciences is that it really doesn't matter what the priors, kind of within limits. They can't be too extreme. So you can't have priors too close to 1 and 0. But so long as you don't get too close to 1 and 0, if you've got enough data, the priors will wash out and you'll end up with the right view. But that's assuming that we're talking about a matter where there's kind of lots of relevant statistical data to search through. Whether we can sensibly talk about priors in areas where we don't have one of those kind of convergence results in the offing is not clear. If I ask you to give me a probability, pick some area where there's, say string theory.
Sure.
Right. Any number that you pick feels like it's going to be rather arbitrary, right? We don't have any data that's relevant. Okay. So I think that subjective theories are difficult except where you have the convergence results and then the priors don't matter. You can just have a prior. Having objective priors is hard for different reason. I mean, there are various accounts of how to get objective priors. One account appeals to something like principles of indifference, but there are various impossibility results like Bertrand's theorem, which show that you can't always, if you've got some, you can't always have a sensible version of principle of indifference. So you can't generate it. So you can't generate objective priors that way.
Okay. I've been really interested. I'm looking to people, for example, Carnap is someone who's also caught my eye, as well as Parfit, but specifically Carnap. When it comes to trying to basically, he wants to make it so that scientists don't have to do, or the scientists don't have to do philosophy, that it's already, completely set out for them and done with. And so, well, they can continue on with their investigations without having to, be, lagged with, different inquiry or philosophical inquiries. And it got me thinking, do you find that, let's say, if you wanted to build let's just say some such theory to explain X, what do you think makes that theory strong? What do you think in question has to be there for, if someone's talking to you about this theory that explains X, you're going to go, wow, this is a very, very, very strong and super, super, super defensible view that you might even be interested in taking up?
So the question's about building a view like Carnap's, but one that works better. Is that the idea? So you want a kind of general model for inquiry that everything can fit into.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, it's something in which everything which seeks to be explained is explained, but it's explained in such a way where maybe you're not over-explained, like you're not, and now having to explain introduce new entities into the question and inflate your ontological economy, but also not under-explained. So now what you want to explain is now, not fully explained. Are there any principles in question that you think when building these theories or when analyzing them, you find that there's certain traits in them that makes one theory particularly better than another? Anything that stands out to you?
So I'm kind of skeptical about there being a kind of general framework for inquiry. This really goes back to a question that I asked, that I discussed briefly earlier about the kind of prospects for sort of general purpose critical thinking. So, I mean, in a way you could think of this as, is there a kind of methodology that once we've got it, we can use it to do maths and physics and chemistry and politics and religion and sociology and whatever. I'm skeptical that there's any such thing. I'm inclined to think that there are kind of methodologies much more piecemeal. They're part of what comes with studying physics or chemistry or molecular biology or whatever, is that you learn the methodologies that are appropriate to studying those kinds of things, but you don't think that they transplant to necessarily to all the other disciplines. So I'm not very sympathetic to Carnap's general program. I just am skeptical that something like that could be done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I have one last question, if that's okay with you. This is one someone else wanted to ask. But I think it was an interesting question as well in the comments. I'm sure you know of the Münchhausen. I know how to pronounce it. The Münchhausen trilemma. And someone was wondering. I mean, now I am too. How do you think this relates, or what might be the implications it has on epistemic certainty?
So I'm not sure. I mean, I guess when you're confronted with a small child and they ask why, and you say something and they ask why, and they say something and you ask why. I mean, there's always that kind of possibility.
Yeah.
But that's not entirely. So here's what I'm thinking. When I look out out my back window and I see the elm tree in the yard, right, and I know that I'm looking at the elm tree, right?
Yeah.
What's the justification for that? Well, or what's the story? So here's a story to tell about that. I stand at the end of a very, very long line of evolution from creatures that were much simpler than human beings. And my cognitive and sensory capacities have been formed by that process in a way that makes them pretty reliable in certain kinds of circumstances. So long as I'm looking at something that's of an appropriate size and it's not too foggy and I haven't been doing too much acid and, a bunch of other things have to be in place, I'm going to be reliable at identifying it. So, that's an elm tree and I'll be getting it right. Now, there's a kind of explanation for why I'm getting it right, which doesn't seem to appeal to any of the problems. It doesn't seem to be circular. It doesn't seem to involve infinite regress, and it doesn't seem to involve particularly any dogmatism. In the particular case, if you're standing there with me and you say, how do you know? Maybe I'll tell you that story. More likely, I'll say, well, look, it's bright and sunny. The tree's only 20 meters away. Can't you see it? Is there something wrong with you? Right. Yeah. But what I won't do is try to offer them an argument, because that would be pointless. If they're going to play some kind of silly skeptical game, I'd rather not join in. I don't know. Does that combination of things answer the question, or you're worried that it doesn't?
Well, yeah. Well, I think, I definitely got the first part, but I'm curious because I guess it didn't in short answer like how it might relate to epistemic certainty. But let's just say, let's say we're in the room together, you and me, right? And then, by the way, I'm not trying to debate you. I do find this really interesting. Yeah. So, we're standing next to each other. You're looking at the elm tree, and I'm like, this guy next to me is crazy. How can he see this elm tree supposedly? And I look at you, and you go, how do you see it? And you go, okay, give the story of the evolutionary tale. And I go, how do you know the story of the evolutionary tale is true? If you're going to tell me that your senses are reliable because of that, how do you even? Well, I mean, it might seem like it has to regress odds, but there at least.
Yeah. So something strange has happened if you can't see the tree. So something's wrong with one of us. What I might do is wait until you go and then get a couple of other people to come and say, can you see the tree? And if they say yes, then I'll infer that something, I've got no idea what, was wrong with you. Either you're being antisocial or your brain had stopped working properly somehow. You've got some kind of cognitive deficit or whatever, right? It could be, at the moment when you first raise it, it could be me or it could be you. But there are investigations that we can do that will answer the question. Like if it turned out that half of people could see it and half of people couldn't, I don't know, that would be weird. It's hard to think of an explanation for that. But things like that don't happen. That's the kind of other part, right? And I think that in general, we shouldn't expect epistemological theories to tell us what it would be right for us to think in cases where we get really bizarre inputs, right? I just think there's no, that's not a profitable exercise.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there are people who think of that as an aim for epistemology, whereas I think that it's pretty good if our epistemology deals with the kinds of inputs that we actually get and gives the right results.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's that despite these, cases where we have these very weird inputs, which might maybe when we're given these weird inputs, it might make trying to, find out who is the individual in question, maybe have like, let's say, a true belief about some X, and all the inputs were actually really weird. Well, for these cases, even though they may be a little bit more, we might be a little bit less sure, we might have a little bit like, we can't maybe appeal to other methods that we have at the moment. Well, that's not too much of a concern because what we actually care to know, the inputs for those are actually pretty good, at least in time tied with our epistemic theories or our best epistemic theories.
Yeah, so something like that sounds right to me.
Gotcha. I appreciate it.
All right, that'll be the end of it. We'd like to thank you, Dr. Graham, for tuning in and engaging with the conversation. And we'd like to thank everybody that asked Dr. Graham a question, text or audio.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank everybody for turning up and for asking the questions. I did my best to answer them. Thank you.